City of Stevens Point Historic Preservation, Design Review Commission meeting, recorded February 13, 2019.
Okay, we're going to reconvene the
Well,
BDRC meeting of February 13th, 2019.
no, it's not the time.
Call to order.
Shane.
Oh, that's a good reminder.
I just want to mention, before we move on to the first agenda item, Mr. Weir did call me and tell me that he may not make the meeting, which would mean that in his absence, Mr. DeBusch, you would have a vote as the first alternate. Otherwise, we do have a quorum and can continue.
All right. Go to item 3, request Redevelopment Authority, Stevens Point, demolish structures.
All right, so we were out in the field. We were able to look at the 3 properties, to walk through the 3 properties, look at the deterioration, maybe look at some of the uniqueness. I put together a very detailed staff report in regards to all 3 properties. The Redevelopment Authority in this case does own the property. They are the ones making the request, not necessarily the developer that has phase 1 of a development project proposed that we'll also get to later in the agenda. But ultimately what will happen is the land identified on the screen will eventually transfer to the developer so that they can begin with the phase 1 of the development. However, again, this request is being made by the Redevelopment Authority. Here's some statistics on the properties. I'm showing just the 2 main buildings here because that's all the assessor's office have on file. The main structure being built in 1899 and the house being built in 1890 with the garage going in 1945. We've got square footage there as well, lot frontage and so forth. Essentially, there are 7 buildings that are being requested to be demolished. You've got the main building top left, the home, and the warehouse building, which were the 3 buildings we went in. Also, there's the garage here, the residential garage, this outbuilding, large outbuilding, and then this is really 2 buildings, I think, that are connected here in the lower right-hand part of the screen. We did not look in any of the garages. You are more than welcome to view those from the exterior during the tour. But as their accessory structures, I did not feel it was necessary to go through those buildings. Again, in terms of the review here, again, the building was operated, or the buildings were operated by the Belke family. The Belke Lumber Company operated in the main building as well as the manufacturing building and also lived within the home. However, recently all buildings have been vacant for quite some time in terms of a use occurring within the buildings. However, a lot of the machinery still did exist within the buildings, but now has been auctioned off by the previous owner. Again, the RA intends to redevelop the site. One thing I do want to note, which is somewhat critical in terms of reuse on the properties, is that given the B2 zoning district classification, residential is not a permitted use. I believe it is a conditional use within the zoning code, but it is not permitted, as well as manufacturing. So a manufacturing use like a lumber mill that was previously in there, or construction, lumber construction factory, could not be resumed because it is not permitted within the zoning district. A heavy manufacturing use like that is not even permitted as a conditional use. So in terms of reuse within the facility, if the Belke family wanted to open the use up again for the same use, it could not happen because it's not permitted under the current zoning standards and zoning districts. So a different use, if it was reused, would have to occur that meets the B2 zoning district use definitions. Here's some more photos. Again, you can see some of the deterioration that has occurred, especially on the exterior of the home. Again, these photos were included within the staff report. These are some photos of the shed. Again, you know, very, very unique in my opinion in terms of, you know, typically you don't walk into like a big barn like this and expect to see that much wood and racking. But again, with regards to the staff report and placing it in context with the design guidelines, that's how the review by staff has been done, and that's where we've come to the conclusion of our recommendation. Same with the manufacturing building and the home. And again, that recommendation is to deny, or to, approve the request for demolition of all 7 structures on the property. Here are my findings with regards to the design guidelines. But basically, we have found no historical significance in relation to the main Belkey building, the lumber building, or the manufacturing building. It is not referenced anywhere in the historic survey, the 2011 historic survey, whereas other commercial buildings in the downtown have been referenced. This building has not. I do want to note, however, that the home was referenced in the survey. The house was identified as being a unique, or one of the last remaining wood-clad, I think, was it square or box-style homes that exist within the city. However, I also want to note that there are 2 other examples, one within the existing historic district and one that's in the proposed historic district. So I don't necessarily think that with its demolition you would be losing that historic character within the district, because there are other examples of that same design within the historic districts. Furthermore, again, based on visual inspection, I believe that the buildings are certainly deteriorated. I think it would be very difficult to find another use. I think it would be very costly as well to find another use in all of the buildings. And thus, again, have come to the conclusion to approve the demolition request. Again, the uniqueness of the zoning, I think, also limits the types of uses that can occur. And then I also feel as though that the materials that have been used to construct the buildings could certainly be reproduced with relative ease. There aren't a whole lot of unique design characteristics or architectural elements on any of the structures. So again, I don't think with their demolition you would be losing any of those historic or any significant features, because there just aren't any that we've identified. So again, with that, we would recommend approval of the demolition. Again, the condition that was included in the staff report is that a raising permit shall be obtained. The second one that I do want to add, which is not in the staff report, is that some of the timbers, some of the stuff internal to the building that may be unique, if that can be repurposed or reused, I'd recommend that either the current owner or the potential developer try to reuse some of that material, so that it doesn't go to waste, given the age of it. But that is the only condition that I've added at this point. And with that, I'll certainly open it up for any questions, and also identify that both the applicant is here, Michael representing the Redevelopment Authority, as well as the Wantas representing the developer of the site.
When you say reuse, you mean in the development that's going to replace this?
No, not necessarily.
Sell it to some.
Right, so that could be, it could be the developer maintaining some of the materials in a storage shed and reusing them for other projects, or it could be the developer, selling them to other parties. And I'm not necessarily specifying what those things are, just that, where applicable, that they be reused.
So the Redevelopment Authority would be doing the demolition, or the developer?
I would probably let Michael, as the applicant, answer that question.
Sure. Michael Ostrowski, Executive Director of the Redevelopment Authority for the city. The intent that we're working on right now is working with Wanta and Son on a redevelopment project on that site. Probably a multi-phase development, with the first phase being the 10 live work units on the southern end of the site abutting the parking lot, which would require the immediate demolition of that large storage shed with all the racking in it. the conversations that we've had with Wanta is that the RA would transfer the site. They would then be responsible for the demolition of the structures.
I was wondering, without getting too far down a rabbit hole, if you could explain sort of the history of the attempt to reuse this space in its current form and some of the challenges that the city and the prior owner have faced in that attempt?
And I can't speak for, the prior owner and Redevelopment Authority recently or relatively recently acquired this property. And there have been interest in the property, but it seems like every time we get to the point where we walk in the building, the coolness factor, you see it, the loft area, and then when you start putting, pen to paper, that's when things start falling apart. It becomes very challenging because it's difficult to determine what you actually have in that building from a structural standpoint and what it's able to support, and then finding a use that is going to fit within that structure and bringing it up to that code. As Kyle had mentioned, we can't just convert these things back to manufacturing. It's not allowed in the district. Residential is a conditional use within the district. The other thing from kind of on my other hat with community development, we see that area as kind of being that next redevelopment area block, as we've had conversations with the Lullaby site and the redevelopment project that is proposed on there, moving westward towards the river. I think the ability to then try to reclaim as much material as you can, if you can repurpose it within the development on site or a few other developments that the developer may end up doing. But the challenge really comes from determining kind of what you have. And really it's a fairly simple construction. And to bring it up to a code to operate, let's say, a brewery or something else within that space is going to be very challenging, where it's going to be much less expensive to rebuild a completely new building. I mean, that's essentially what you're going to end up having to do with this building, is building a new structure around it and leaving kind of that interior stuff as kind of like a wall decoration, but the exterior structure around it's going to have to be rebuilt.
Thank you.
What about the house? Has there been any effort to renovate that house? Or?
Again, because of the nature of, you would not be able to automatically move into there as a home. Due to the zoning characteristics, that would be problematic. There has been interest in, I've had a gentleman in my office about every month looking to reclaim the siding as well as some of the trim within the house, because he has a home that has the same clad siding. But the challenge with the house is, one, being used as a single-family residential, which is not allowed permitted use under the current zoning code. It is allowed under, as a conditional use, but from a planning perspective, I would have a hard time recommending approval of a conditional use for a single-family use within that area of the downtown, given kind of what it would do to the surrounding uses and being problematic for the redevelopment thereof. I think if there's an interest in someone in moving the home, we had looked at potentially moving it on a lot that was on Meadow Street that was owned by Habitat. Unfortunately, Habitat is really just building new homes, not remodeling existing ones. But I think if there's a user out there that would like the house and working with the RA and Wanta in order to move it, I think that would definitely become a potential, because it'd be a lot easier, cheaper probably to move it if they're willing to incur that expense than it would be to tear it all down.
And the only building that's in the way right now of the phase one of the proposed development is that?
So the large storage shed is the only building that would be needed to complete phase one. I will condition that on, though, to be probably successful in leasing out those units, given what Wanta, and you'll see with the next agenda items in terms of their developments. You can look on page 28 of your packet with the Wanta development. The rear of that building is really the residential element of their development. So that area would face north, and it would face the rest of the Belkey property. And being able to lease those buildings with the state in which those buildings are in, the main building and the house, I think becomes very problematic in terms of being able to lease those buildings and being successful in that development if you have those buildings continuing to stand. I've been in my role with the city since 2010 and working on the Lullaby property and trying to get that redeveloped. And every single developer almost who has tried to develop that Lullaby property has always pointed across the street and says, what's happening with that? It's very problematic in terms of the redevelopment approach, given the state of which those buildings are in.
Is there going to be any sort of outreach to find someone that might want to move the house?
We could. I mean, we could do an outreach on that. I don't think that would be a problem to try and do that right now. Like I said, our negotiations that we're working with Wanta would be for them to incur the cost of the demolition to tear down the house, but I don't think that would be a problem. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn. If someone wants to move the house, that will let them move it.
Yes.
I'd like to inject a couple of things.
Could you come to the microphone so we could get you on record, please?
Okay, my name is Jim Belkey. I was the executive of the estate, family member, grandson of Emil, and Eric was my uncle. My dad was Ed. When it comes to the home, you put out there's a couple of houses that have that type of siding, and we already have a couple in the historical district, so this would not be even a consideration. So are those other two houses out there, do they have the interior similar to what the Belkey house is? With the uniqueness of some of the things in there?
I don't necessarily know. I haven't been in the two homes that were referenced in the historic survey.
I would ask that you take all things into consideration when you make that choice.
The other thing to note is that the design guidelines that have been adopted specifically focus on the exterior architectural elements and not necessarily the interior elements of structures. Typically, from the public's viewpoint, properties are historically relevant given, the make, the design, architectural features, materials, facade materials. That's where you, as a community, tend to, capture architectural significance in buildings because, the general public isn't allowed in all of these houses that are owned privately. So the design guidelines don't necessarily focus on the interior, and this commission can't necessarily look at the interior of structures in terms of, responding to different requests, whether it's design review or demolition. It's primarily focused on the exterior of structures.
Okay, so that's your guideline.
Adopted by the city
Okay.
and carried out by this body.
Number two, my great-grandpa August Belkey moved in with my grandpa when he was sick. And he passed away in his 60s. When he passed away, he received substantial honors overseas in Prussia. The King of Prussia honored him personally. Does that lead any significance to the fact that he had lived and died there? I've got my great-grandpa's
It probably
citizenship
falls,
papers, and I've got his passport, and I've got some artifacts from him, and I've got the medals that he received from the king.
I think it certainly can be subject to review by this body if they want to take that into consideration. I'd leave that up to the chairperson to determine.
a history of a significant individual, let's say, is one of about 5 items that are used to determine the value in keeping the property. A noted architect, a particular style, a noted individual. There's a firm list, and this may fall within that. Certainly take some work.
Do you realize that a lot of the architecture in Stevens Point was done at Belkey Lumber Company?
Yes.
by Emil Belkey? Almost every single church in Portage County and some outside of Portage County. I've got his toolbox. He did a lot of handcrafting stuff. He
Yeah,
made
there's a lot of history in
he made
that
a lot of the
property.
side altars and the pews and all this other kinds of stuff for the churches, for the convent, I'm talking St. Joe's, I'm talking Hardware Mutuals. He did a lot of work for all those places. And I guess my point here is, look around you. There's a lot of history there. He made it. And to me, It seems like just to tear everything down and just throw everything aside and say, well, too bad, so sad, now we're gonna put up some brand-new buildings without any consideration, I think is, borderline disgraceful. And I know how much he did for this community. My dad was on the planning committee, and he did all, he was police and fire commission, all these other kinds of things, but to step forward and just throw it in the garbage, because that's the way of the millennials. They don't care about history. Not very many of them do. We didn't get to where we are today by sitting on our rear ends. We had a heck of a lot better work ethic than most millennials had. We earned everything. I remember when I worked for 5 cents an hour. Well, when I made $1 an hour working at the Fox Theater, I thought I was really making some serious money back then. But my point here is when you make these decisions, you can do your homework based upon zoning and things of that particular type. I'm on the town planning committee myself for the town of Linwood. And you really need to take a look and take into consideration the older people of the community. And it doesn't seem to me like the older people in the community are part of the planning or consideration in Stevens Point. You've got a big monument you're putting on there to Russia along the Wisconsin River, sister city. Nicaragua, sister city. There's a little bit for the Polish people and the rest of the people that really built Stevens Point.
So was there something you had in mind on a way of preserving all of that
Well,
property?
I think, for instance, Lullaby. What are you going to call Lullaby when you develop it? What's the name? Can't you at least honor some of the people that lived here and built all this stuff before? Like the Buchel family or something along those lines? As part of the wording or whatever you put in there? The name of the structure or the name of the development?
I don't think you're going to find anybody on this commission that doesn't agree with you. It's just how do you do some of these things? I have had some discussions with the people building some of the new senior housing. And they're open to possibly having a small museum in there near the entry door or something with possible items from the Historic Society. Beyond those sorts of things, there's not much we can do about it. We're here to agree to tear them down. Sort of too late to start trying to do anything particularly historic about it.
Well, for instance, if you move the house.
Who built it? Which family member built it? August?
No, Emil.
Emil.
That was his home.
Okay.
August lived on Smith Street.
But you've got to find somebody that wants the house. You'd have to give it away, and then it's probably going to cost them $70,000 to move it.
$20,000. 22
How much?
is what I was told. 20 to 22,000 to move it.
22?
Yeah, you can get underneath it.
It's a pretty simple house. pretty
Yeah, but
small
it was 2 or 3 times that much 20 years ago.
Well, that's what I was told last year.
There's been a lot of houses moved that
I was told that last year.
well, if somebody can move it for 20, tell them to come get it. Don't know what else to do.
Has anybody come forward? Said, here's what it's gonna cost to
Well,
move
I
it.
think that's an option that should be pursued, is to
I think you should at least
I mean, because I don't know if that's been known. I know there's been a for sale sign in front of that house for a long time, and obviously somebody's not going to buy it.
Well, there are a lot
But
of-
if the city can, or the Redevelopment Authority can give it away, if the developer can compensate the amount that would have been spent to demolish it as part of a credit towards moving it, somebody might come forward with that. It should at least be maybe sit out there for a while, a period of time.
Well, it was out there with a sign on it independently. And I met with a lot of people that were interested in the property, but they couldn't meet the codes. I even met with the city inspector. I won't say what her name is or what her opinion was, but I've had people come up with different opinions than what the city architects and engineers have come up with. But it wasn't a go because of certain factors. Like anything in zoning, when it comes to zoning, there's a certain amount of flexibility to zoning. And I think you'll agree with me on that, Mike. Yes, there is. Well, people put in 4 exceptions all the time, don't
Mr.
they?
We're off track.
Mr. Chairman, I'd advise to take public comment, take public questions, and then maybe bring it back to the commission for discussion. If the commission has additional comments or questions from any of the members in the audience, I think that's appropriate as well, but I would advise against this back and forth.
I agree.
Things aren't being recorded. If there's comments going to the public as well in the audience.
I think they should at least try.
Yeah, all we can do is try, get the word out there if possible, and thank you.
Hi, I'm Kathy Dugan. I live on the east side of Stevens Point, and I'm an alder for that area, District 8. And I've had a long time interest in historic preservation, as I think Lee knows. And I'm here to, in support of saving and reusing some of it. I've talked with Ryan Wanta online. We've had several conversations by email. And I want to show you something, if the chair would allow me to show you something that has been done in Stillwater, Minnesota, with a building that's very, very much like the Belkey main building. If there were a chance to save that building or a portion of it, it could look something like this. And as I said, Ryan and I have talked about this. Would it be okay if I showed pictures and sent these around to you?
Sure, you want to pass it down?
Yeah. Just pass. And this is, yeah, and this is the, it's called the Isaac Staple Sawmill. It's very, very similar. It's slightly bigger, but very similar to the design and the structure that we're talking about now. The same siding, the same windows. Must have been sort of a way to rubber stamp the lumber buildings in those days. This building was saved in part because of the history, part of the lumber business in that area. And that would be a reason, you know, if anybody sought the financing to reuse this building and to get historic preservation approval of doing that, or perhaps the National Register of Historic Places, it would probably have to come from the history rather than the design or the architectural uniqueness. And I think that's what happened in Stillwater. A similar kind of thing happened with the,
Kathy, if you could speak more directly into the microphone.
actually, it doesn't matter much. These things pick it up really fast, but I will. The Pioneer Place, which was a big warehouse for Lullaby, I believe, that is on the Historic Register, and people went forward to do that. It's right next to MEJ's across First Street. So it would be something like that, I think. As I said, I've talked with Mr. Wanta. There are lots of difficulties, but I want to. He's listed some of the difficulties that Kyle Kearns has, and that the RA rep has also. But he comes down to this. We are still in talks with people who would be interested in saving the building and are definitely open to hear more cases. We would need the right person or group of people with the finances and patience in seeing any return on their investment. It's a risky venture, but there are people out there like that. In the meantime, we will keep our fingers crossed in hopes that someone like that will come along. However, in order for us to move forward with our plans, we need to know that if attempts to save the building fall through, salvaging and demolishing would stand as an option. And that's why demolishing is probably a good thing to approve right now. But it doesn't mean that we're going to say it has to come down right now. There may be some ways to look into saving a portion of it at least. For the safety of the community, he goes on, allowing a building to continue to stand vacant and deteriorate would remain a huge concern. Everyone would like to see this entire block come back to life once again. I will again say that it always was our intention to save the site. Every person who has walked through sees the possibilities. But it is the reality of what needs to happen that makes it so prohibitive. It's costly, very costly. It will take money. I hope you don't mind my quoting you, Ryan. We've had some good talks, he and I. I think we've appreciated both of our interests. So that's for me.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you. Any questions or comments, or yes?
So the agenda item itself, as everyone knows, is about demolition. With all due respect to Mr. Belke, I fully understand and am aware that there's a lot of emotion attached to this property. And there are a lot of people that do care about the history of Stevens Point. And some of the comments that I'm hearing have to do with creating a memorial to a business. And I just want to have everyone think about that for a minute. There's a lot of businesses in Stevens Point that have contributed to Stevens Point and its history. Do we create memorials for each one of those businesses? But let's think about history. And whose history are we telling? We are standing on Menominee land. We don't have a single memorial, to my knowledge, to the Menominee people or any of the native peoples whose land this was that was taken by white people. So if we want to start talking about history, let's be honest about the histories that we are talking about, and it's not one. There's even according to the archaeologist at UWSP, there is, at the site of Old Main, a burial. It's not a mound, it's a burial. So, native burial. We have to be realistic about what can be saved in this community and how to do that. And I have struggled with this, and I am passionate about history, historic buildings, and I realize when you commented that you started in 2010 as the Director Ostrowski, that's the year I moved to Stevens Point. And yes, I have walked these streets and imagined what those buildings could be. But as an alder, understanding how the city actually runs and how the city actually has to pay for services, it's not possible to save those buildings. However, we can, as a commission, ensure that the materials are repurposed and salvaged. And we can insist on that more than just, I think, suggest it in a way. And so unless there's more comments, I'm ready to make a motion, but I'll see if anyone else wants to comment.
No, go ahead.
I had one question about what is it going to look like, because the building that's Kim's Barrel Inn is not being proposed to be torn down, but it appears these buildings are connected. What's that going to look like in between, and is there going to be any requirements for what has to happen with that?
So the land that the Redevelopment Authority owns includes the Belke property, does not include Kim's Barrel Inn, nor does it include, there's a small engine repair shop. The buildings, the facade, when you look at the front of them, look connected, but there is a space between the buildings. You know, until the buildings are removed, we don't know the condition of that wall. But if it is in a deteriorated state, there are certain codes that need to be followed for the city that would have to bring that back up to code. So really, it's difficult to determine what it looks like now because it's covered up by the Belke building. But there is a small space between the Belke building and that small engine repair shop.
And that small engine repair shop is remaining as well?
Correct.
What is the time frame that we're working with here in terms of redeveloping, is there time to look at alternative options? What
So
what is all of
the
this?
anticipated timeframe for phase one of the approach would be this year.
Okay.
To remove the buildings this year, to start the construction of phase one with the Wanta development, very similar to the Lullaby site. The intention for that construction is to start this summer. Phases 2 and phase 3, depending on how many phases there will be with this development, could follow shortly thereafter, depending on kind of how phase 1 goes. But the intent is to start pretty much immediately with this. And like I said, I think if there's a desire and there's someone out there who's willing to take the home and move it, I think we open to that. But you know, being honest, I mean, that home has sat vacant probably since the late 1990s. And it's been there. The shop has sat vacant for several years as well, and I think it's just going to be a very big challenge to try to move that structure, and it is costly to move, and that's why we don't see many movings of buildings anymore. We used to, quite a few, but because of the cost to move the structures and the complexity of moving structures in terms of lifting power lines and depending on where you're going with them, if you had a place really, really close, that'd be probably one consideration as we looked at the lot on Meadow Street because it was relatively close. But if you have to move at any distance, it can be very problematic depending on the route that you're taking.
How long is the house?
How long?
Does it say in here?
It's a cube, so it should be relatively as long as it is wide.
It's a rectangle.
I'll have to, give me a
Okay, I
second.
didn't, I don't remember looking at that. I'm sorry, ballpark what? 43?
So if you look on page,
Put it on your trailer or something?
No, but we've moved 8 buildings so far.
if you look on page 24, Commissioner Siebert, that will give you the dimensions
Okay.
that are listed in the assessor's office records. 26 by 42 plus 7 plus 6 when you add the porches.
Okay.
So not necessarily a cube,
Yeah,
but close.
okay, I missed that, thank you.
Mike, can you say more or clarify, people who've had interest, who've come into the main building, looked at it, can you say how many, what the reactions were, what kind of feedback you've gotten from
So again,
possibility
I
or-
won't name specific names, but
Sure, I
there,
understand.
beyond Wantas, there were at least 2 others that had walked through that building with me regarding that structure. Not sure how many Jim may have had, but in the time where the RA started to negotiate with the Belkey estate, up until acquiring it and working with the Wantas, there were 2 others, at least 2 others that I had walked through the building with. And a lot of it, again, just comes down to money in terms of trying to repurpose that building, because you really don't know what you're starting with. You have to do probably $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 worth of analysis just to determine what you have. And then once you determine what you have, well, now where do you need to get to? So that's been one of the challenge that nobody's willing to upfront that $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 on the engineering and analysis to determine what you have. I'm sure it's built very, very strong, and you could say that all day to an inspector, but they're going to want to see that on paper and an engineer signing off on that.
Okay, if we were to approve staff recommendation, I say it does include repurposing materials.
To the extent possible, I think there's been a desire to repurpose that materials. And again, if there's interest in someone moving the house, we would definitely take a look at that. But, you know, as Ryan had mentioned through the email with Alder Dugan, there's uncertainty if someone wants to do a project on this that's a multi-phase. Yes, we only need to realistically take down that first building in order to make that work. But I don't know a developer who would take on the risk of taking the entire property, not having the assurance that the other buildings could come down if they can't find a user for them. So that's also been a challenge. So I think if the approval is to demolish the buildings and raise the buildings, I think every effort's going to be made to either repurpose the materials and or move the house as best they can, as well as if there is a user who wants to come in and repurpose the building and all of a sudden there's a windfall of money and they don't really care on making a return, I think they would consider looking at that.
So if you put out the word that all of it is available for salvage, but short timelines. I don't know if there's anybody around here that's capable of coming in or has the manpower or anything else to disassemble those.
So they have worked with a demolition contractor who probably gave a very favorable bid because of the ability to salvage those materials. The initial bid we had to demo everything and landfill it was $300,000. The other bid's much cheaper than that because of the ability to salvage materials.
Mhm. At this point, you just want it all to be gone. So if you can get somebody to take it down for free and haul it all off and reuse it in some fashion, and I don't know how we find that person, social media,
And again, that will be,
papers.
that would be as part of the workings with Wanta, as part of that development agreement. They would be in charge of the raising of the buildings, however that might take place.
Do you have any use for these materials? Are you intending to?
Yeah, we're definitely intending to reuse some of the materials.
Could you answer that question at the podium, please? Thanks.
Yeah, I'm Randy Wanta from Wanta and Son and Wanta Properties. Yes, we definitely, that's the intention. With the person I've worked with for years that does excavation and demolition for me, he has people that he works with too that want to come in and repurpose the material.
Okay.
That's the reason for the more economical bid that we got, because they plan on reusing a lot of the material that they can.
Yeah,
So
an
that's the-
amazing amount of material there.
You know, and that's, we're giving them a certain time frame because it needs to go if we're gonna do what we need to do. But we definitely want to reuse, we'll probably keep some of it ourselves too and reuse inside of buildings and different things, so definitely, we have appreciation for that, there's no question about it. So that's our intention. Okay?
Okay, let's hang on for a second there, please. I'm not sure if I've got any more questions for that, but trying to think, do the recommendations we have cover the contractor? They will be required to repurpose the materials?
So yes, if you approve it with the recommendations on the screen, that's correct. Whether it's the redevelopment authority that demolishes it or any subsequent party thereafter.
Okay, so either or, there would be a requirement.
That's our intention, that's what we,
Okay,
the reason for doing it, you know.
we
We
just
wanna,
need to hear it from you.
you heard it from me.
All right. Yes.
I'll make a motion to approve the demolition of structures at 1013 Second Street and the home at 1016 Third Street with staff recommendations.
Would you want to add anything about the attempts to be made to move the house? And
Does that fall
Advertising
under,
it.
I think that falls under repurpose, but would it need a set?
You know, if you guys
That's
certainly want to
repurposing it.
clarify it, you certainly can if you want to separate it.
So you would
but-
add including the potential relocation of,
I certainly
house.
can to the minutes and the approval, if you'd like your motion to state that.
yeah, as a possibility, not as a requirement,
Okay.
now,
just for clarification.
this gets us right into timelines.
We need a second, then? Sorry.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a second. But this gets us into the timelines. If we say they must be removed or whatever within 30 days, 90 days, 6 months.
So I guess I'm not following in terms of timelines. I think, you know, the intent here with Phase 1 and working with the Wanta is that we'd probably reach some sort of an agreement, hopefully in the month of March, right, for kind of the land discussion, with then the intention of possibly transferring the property sometime late spring, early summer. They are going through currently historic preservation for the approval of the design for Phase 1. They're also going in front of the Plan Commission for a conditional use permit for Phase 1 this month. But in terms of transferring of the property, probably is going to occur early summer, somewhere around then, and then being able to work again with their contractor to see what can be repurposed on that building. But in the meantime, if there's interest out there by someone to take the house, that could be done with this. I don't think we'd establish a timeline on when the buildings need to be torn down, because if there's someone who has interest that tries to save it, that would at least, without the timeline, give the ability for Wanta and Son to work with them to try to save something.
Okay, so it's up to Wanta then to find somebody to move the house? And it sounds like you'd just soon have it there to salvage materials?
So they have a contractor that they have worked with who has given them a bid to do the removal of all the structures. And as Randy had mentioned, likely because the reason why it is so inexpensive is because of their ability to repurpose the materials. If you were just to dump everything in a landfill, you'd probably be at that couple $100,000 mark, not only because of the demolition and the destruction of the materials, but because it's somewhat challenging to demo the main bulky building. As Eric had mentioned, it's very close to that adjacent building, so it's going to be a very careful peeling away of that building towards the southern end of the property, because there's only a few feet in between it. But I don't know if I would associate or put a timeline on there. I think the motion and the staff recommendation is going to create the need to have those materials repurposed in some form or fashion.
Okay.
I think you're saying that option of moving the building or doing something with the house or whatever is available until the point in which it's transferred to Wanta's.
I guess
at
it's
that
available.
point, it's up to them.
Yeah, it's available until the point where Wanta's
Tear it down.
commence or execute the contract to tear it down.
But their bid is based on these items being there for them to salvage.
True, but there is a cost to even no one's coming in there to tear them down for free. So if someone comes in there to tear it down for free, that's much more economical than the other bid that we definitely take a look at.
Yeah, but if we get the city trying to repurpose, that changes their idea of the property. They're expecting to get it as is right now.
Correct.
and
Our
repurpose.
negotiations have been, yes, the property it's sold as is.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Additional question, comment? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No. No.
All right, duly noted. Okay, we move on. Item 4, design review. Live work unit development.
So again, this is the development that the Wantas have proposed, Phase 1 on the south side of the property. It is a 10-unit live-work building, meaning that on the first floor, there will be commercial storefronts that face south, and on the second floor, there'll be living units. So an occupant within one of the locations would essentially work and live out of the same unit. Garages are also proposed on the rear of the structure, as well as a balcony area above the garage. This is something very unique to Stevens Point. We don't really have any of these. However, it is a very traditional approach to living and owning and operating a business, because the downtown was essentially founded with this principle. Many business owners lived above their operation in the first floor on Main or Clark Street or in other communities as well. So this is just the approximate location of Phase 1 of where the building would sit. At this point, I also want to note that the parking lot to the south is proposed to be redeveloped. That is owned by the city of Stevens Point. The reason it's proposed to be redeveloped is because it's in pretty rough shape in terms of the asphalt, but also there's a very large storm sewer that diverts Moses Creek beneath, and that will likely be maintained because costs to relocate that are significant. And if the utility underneath the parking lot is in good shape, then there's really no reason to relocate it and or replace it. So that'll be maintained, hence the building will be facing south. And the parking lot, the existing City of Stevens Point parking lot will be maintained by the city, however, will likely be utilized primarily by the apartments and by the commercial storefronts for this Phase 1. So again, I've somewhat gone over the review here. Because it's new construction within the historic district, the commission must make a recommendation. I'm getting a delay here on the mouse, so hopefully it'll connect. And again, the applicant, the Ryan Wanta, who's the architect here, knows a lot more and can provide a little more detail than I can. But basically, it looks like I skipped the site plan. All right. So again, here's the site plan. You've got the parking lot that's reconstructed on the south. You have access on the north side of the building. There'll be an alleyway that connects to 2nd Street and 3rd Street to allow for access to the rear units and the garages in the rear. This is some renderings of what the building would look like. This actually closely kind of resembles the mixed use that you recently approved on the Lullaby site in terms of facade materials. So again, from a design, from an architectural standpoint, I think it complements that development quite well. The three facade materials, main facade materials here are both masonry block as well as metal paneling. You've got a metal roof as well, and then some cedar to mix in some warm tones to the building as well and separate those storefronts. That cedar also carries through to the rear of the development along the garages and to separate the raised balconies or raised porches. Here's another elevation of the structure, rear elevation here. I'll try to be quick at this point because all of this is in your packet, and I know Ryan can certainly speak to this better than I can. In terms of the review, however, staff feels as though, from a massing standpoint, this does a very good job of, going from or kind of acting in a transitional zone from, the remnants of the mall that were a very high one-story into this development, and then into eventually the residential that exists on Portage Street. So from a massing and scale standpoint, we feel that it is appropriate, as well as the facade materials that are proposed. You've got, kind of the warm tones with the cedar as well as cold with the metal features in the block. There's no ephes that's proposed, so I think that's also fitting. And again, we're not necessarily trying to, with new development in a transitional zone on the edge of the historic district, we're not trying to recreate a fake historic appeal here. We obviously, I think, want the building to stand on its own, and I think it does a very good job of that, while also complementing with the existing structures that we have, the remnants of the mall, the new cobblestone hotel, as well as the buildings that were proposed on Lullaby. So with that, we would recommend approval with the staff conditions outlined in the staff report, and that will hopefully be up on the screen shortly. That's all I have.
Okay. I have a question or two, maybe off the track a little. It's the only thing we can have an opinion on is exterior materials, et cetera. I'm curious about the live and work. What if someone's business fails? They have to move then? Is that the way that works, or?
Hey everyone, I'm Ryan Wanta. I'm representing Wanta Properties and Wanta and Son. I'm the designer of this project, and you have a question concerning the lease agreements. For each unit, obviously we're working out with our lawyers right now how we're going to approach leasing this new type of concept, new and old. Ideally, we want to prefer to have people who have businesses that are operating. I think whether it's private or public, having a business operating next door will help feed the community of entrepreneurs in this situation. So what I think we're going to require moving into lease agreements is we're going to have to review business plans. And part of the problem in some of these and doing the research on what people have done in the past and what's happening now is that people will move in and they will just decide to operate a shell business out of there and kind of leave it vacant, but utilize the commercial property for tax purposes. That's something I really want to avoid, because I think the whole purpose of this and what makes it vibrant and attractive to people moving into the building is that there are businesses that are vibrant next door. So if if like a business were to fail, I can't answer specifically what would happen in our lease process right now at that point, but I think there should be exit strategies built into our lease agreements for sure, because not every business, you can't force a business to continue if it's not continuing. So to answer that question, that's as much as I can give you right now at that point, but that is certainly a very important part of developing our leasing
In fact,
process.
there's an awful lot of small businesses that end up being operated as a hobby rather than a moneymaker.
Yeah, yeah.
We have several around town. So I'm trying to get my head wrapped around that whole concept.
Well, ideally, it's for an entrepreneur who wants to have a storefront or who wants to have like a commercial, a real legitimate commercial front to their business. And I mean, it's not saying that the whole of the place can't be used for commercial. If somebody wanted to do that, they certainly could, but the code states for it to be a live-work situation, you can only have 50% of it. And that's because of taxes. You can only declare, if you're working from home, 50% of your residence at up to 50% of your residence for tax purposes. But there's no saying that you can't run a whole business 100% there and not live there. That's just the tax code. But this would be built under commercial code. So that's the real benefit of having it done this way.
So somebody could have the business, but the living quarters could be rented out to someone else?
You see, that's one of those sticky situations too in our leasing agreements. It depends on who they're going to be renting to. When it qualifies as lived work, the proprietor, and they like to call it proprietor because that's sort of how this model was developed, it was a proprietorship, is that the person who owns the business is required to live at the same property in order for that to work. So I don't think it's going to be possible for them to sublet the place, especially if they want to have their business open to a sublessor, after hours, which is kind of an awkward situation.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm just wondering if you would sort of briefly reiterate what you've, I think, presented in plan, but just let the commission know, in case people don't, that you have experience with this. What was the inspiration?
Oh, yeah.
And also your attachment to this place, that you have a history here, so.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the area. Obviously, I'm going to be third generation in our family business. My grandfather had a lumber company, and he built barns post beam in the area. And my father, when he died, my father was 20 or 19. Yes, he took over the business then, and he grew it to what it is today. And we do commercial building, we do industrial building. And I, as part of looking towards the future in the company, I have to figure out a way to make it my own. So, and in the same effect, make sure that we have something to take care of my family when they're in their old age. I went to UWSP for 1 year. After that, I went to school in Paris in fine art. I also went to school in London for design, and I lived in New York for 10 years and operated a business out of there. Also, when I moved to Los Angeles after that, I lived there for 3 years, and I had a fashion label company there with a friend of mine. And we came across a property after living there for about a year that was just like this. It was a live-work situation. We had a storefront and a place to run our business and a cutting room and assembly room. And then I also lived upstairs. So, I mean, as an entrepreneur and a small business owner and a person who works very hard, it was ideal because, not only did it cut my commute into like 1 minute, but it allowed us to combine all of our expenses under one roof. And when you're a small company, every dollar really matters. And that really helped us. We were able to show in Europe, we were able to show across the United States. We had some great success for a little while. And after living in that and experiencing an entire community of people who, they all had different businesses. One was an interior design company. One had a music recording studio. One had a shoe store. We had a storefront to attach to our building and for appointments and fittings. It was really wonderful to have that. And moving back here after that situation, I just kept thinking about that building. And of course, my family's company, we build buildings. And this was kind of a retrofit industrial-like type space that I lived in. It was concrete floors, exposed beams, exposed ductwork. It was pretty cool. And people really clamored to get into these spaces. And I just kept thinking, God, wouldn't it be cool to be able to do something like this? And eventually I saw and I heard from one of my friends, Andrea, that, Belkey building was for sale. And there was also the Lullaby lot. Talked to the city. They have a lot of spaces available. So I started that conversation and reached out to Mike. And I think it's been over a year and a half that we've been talking about doing this. And, initially I looked at the Lullaby site, and because of the huge lot, and the idea of doing it in phases, that was, probably one of our challenging stumbling block that was put in front of us was that, well, what if this doesn't work? What's going to happen with the rest of the lot? And we were pointed out then across the street to the Belkey site again, and it seemed to be the absolutely perfect size to start. I took the first phase of that first property, and I relocated it. It fit perfect right in the south side. And I was able to fine-tune that plan from there and really focus on what I really started out focusing on was creating a space that was live, work, that was something that in this area I haven't seen any of that kind of industrial cool space. And there are a lot of people, a lot of professionals I know that, are looking for something like this in the area, and there's nothing like it. And what I'm trying to do is just capture a little bit of the spirit that we have here and help bring these small businesses in and help them grow and give them a spot downtown and bring more people living downtown and really help grow that. What initially I think grew Stevens Point is that idea of people being able to live at their shop and save some money and get it done. I feel like I'm rambling, but I don't know if there's any other questions that can help direct this.
Get you off track here just a slight bit.
Okay.
These nice patios that are on top of the garages,
Yes.
how do you do snow removal?
Well, where it's going to be designed, so if there would be like 3 feet of snow on there, it would be, take the load of it. That's a metal frame building. It's going to have, and we're working this out with engineering, a flat roof system, rubberized, and I'm looking to probably throw some heat coils up there, just in case. I mean, turn on by a switch or something. But it would have a pedestal system with pavers on top of that. So any kind of melt would go underneath that, and I want to redirect all that melt water to the center of the building, keep it warm and flowing out.
One way to do it. Yeah. Okay, getting back to materials, exterior. We have any,
I see there's a condition on here on the recommendation that you add stuff to the sides. Is that gonna be an issue for you in the design that you've already made?
No, actually, what I was considering in those spaces, those open spaces, is a sort of grill-like feature that you can grow climbing vegetation on. And that it in itself can help cool the building in the summer, keep it nice and cool. And, you know, I just love green space, and I can imagine if somebody had some sort of signage that they wanted to put on top of that and it was illuminated, it would be very, very beautiful.
You would also like to have solar panels in the roof.
Oh, yes, yes. You know, in determining our costs, I kind of want to make this building be relevant in the future. And in the future, if you're not off-grid or at least stepping in that direction, you're just not relevant. You know, you're just going to end up costing all of your business owners inside more money on their utilities, and they're going to start looking elsewhere. So I want to have built in mind and all the infrastructure inside this building to convert to solar panels. We've been looking into solar film that actually fit between the channels in the metal roofing system. Just to be prepared for this, because I know that there are a lot of expenses you can sidestep if you think about it ahead of time. And I mean, ideal, if we find the money in our budget and we're able to do it, we'll do it. But, you know, there are certain things on this project that, just as a dreamer and a small business owner here now, with like mountains of money pouring out of me, but to be able to think, well, how can I improve this? How can I afford this? And just to keep that flexibility in the structure, already utilizing passive solar design. And those little things, I think, to be able to move into a building and say that your building has, you know, your business has these features to it that are conscious about where we're going, I think that's going to be very important. And not to mention, you know, after seeing storms knock out power in the area, to say that, okay, we have wall batteries, we have solar panels, to know that you have coolers that are filled with produce that aren't going to melt, I think that's a very, very important security to have. And I would love to be able to offer that in this building. Oh, the green space. Well, what we tried to do here also in the site is, you know, work around what was already there. You know, we had the parking lot, and I understand why the city would want to keep it. It all makes a lot of sense. But to maintain some of the vegetation that's already there on site, those trees that I put in some of my renderings are exactly where there are trees right now. I want to incorporate native vegetation, but to maintain as much green space as possible. I also think like the two end units, depending on what kind of tenant we find for those spaces, those could be utilized for almost outdoor spaces. Say if we have a cafe or I don't know, any kind of place that would require to have an outdoor space, those little areas would be, you know, really vital to have and attached to your building. I guess what I really want to achieve here is, you know, almost like a public garden around the building. And right now, in this lot, you know, with the alley, I understand that there's a lot of pavement there. I still want to maintain that feeling like we're a part in this community that really cares about these things. And looking to the north of it and those lots, to really in the future phases, to really maintain those green spaces, to really encourage these wonderful use of the trees that we have there that have, I think, a part of the history and the footprint of this site. I think that's really important. You know,
Do you hope to do something similar with phase 2 and 3, or might it be something?
I hope to. You know, one of the phases was hinging on, well, if any of these people we've been talking to in the Belkey building, if it goes through, it would be something very similar to what's there. I kind of like the idea of marrying the aesthetic of, you know, we live in a rural Wisconsin, you know. We have these old farm buildings. We have buildings that have some metal siding on it. I really like that aesthetic. I really like the silver galvalume look. You know, it kind of takes on the color of the sky and the surroundings around it. And married with the wood, you know, this is taking something that's very traditional Wisconsin and it's marrying it with something that's very modern, and it's looking towards the future. And I think, like, as a shifting landscape architectural wise, like, this is a great trajectory to go down, because, you know, there's nothing in the future that are going to be built except for new buildings and buildings that have been married with older structures. So to be able to continue that sort of tradition of nodding to the past and marrying that with the future, I think, is the best route.
Okay, anybody want to put forth a motion? Or I will, to approve based on staff recommendations?
I'll second.
Additional question, comment?
Just a quick thing, so we don't have to come back if this occurs. If they decide to put solar panels on that, whether or not that could be included as part of the motion, that would allow them to add the solar panels. I don't know if that was part of the staff recommendations, but if they can add solar panels as part of this approval process in the future, with then just the designated agent and chairperson to review that design.
I don't have any problems with that. We could certainly add that to the motion to approval of solar panels.
Tori, would you
Right.
second the
Yes, I
addition
second
of the
that.
condition? Okay.
Okay. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right. Okay, Redevelopment Authority, review reconstruction parking lot.
So again, I touched on this quickly already. The Redevelopment Authority is looking to gain approval to reconstruct the parking lot. Again, this is a city lot right now that's serves very little use. I think it's an overflow lot for Midstate Technical College. It also is a lot that the police department does issue overnight parking permits in, but I don't think very many people in downtown take advantage of that, given the closer proximity to other lots. So again, I see this lot primarily serving the project that was just discussed. But again, reconstruction would need to happen. If you can remember, Jerry's Auto used to sit on the west side of the site and was actually on a different lot. So with the proposed redevelopment of the parking lot, it would essentially become one lot, and that's shown here. Traffic would still utilize the existing 3rd Street access point, and then the former driveway for the auto shop off of Second Street there. And there's a total of 66 lots. Again, the underground utility, the very large storm sewer would remain and would not be replaced or touched with the reconstruction of the parking lot. I also want to note that while a landscape plan was not submitted with the request, that the zoning code would still require that typical landscape standards be met. They are showing in the plan that they are accounting for landscaping, continuous screening around the entirety of the site. So from what I can tell, if they plant the appropriate shrub rates and tree specifications within the green areas identified, that they would meet the landscaping requirements also. But essentially, it's got to be continuously screened. So shrubs entirely around, except for on the northern side where the building would abut the parking lot, trees within the terminal islands, and space 50 feet apart. So again, a lot of green, more so than a lot of the parking lots have downtown right now. So again,
The change that's going to occur with the parking addition on the south side of the Lullaby site, does that have any effect on this, or? They
So,
being considered together, or?
yeah, the Lullaby site is taking access off of a driveway on Portage Street and then a driveway on Union Street. So right now, this would be the only driveway on the block on Third Street.
I'm just thinking about, we're losing a driving lane, it's going to become a parking lane. So on the far right edge of this, that's going to look a little different as you come to this lot. So it's still going to be 3 lanes wide at this point?
So what we're gonna look at in working with our Public Works Department is exploring kind of that third lane, as you saw with the Lullaby lot, potentially turning that northernmost lane into parallel parking. Likely could continue on this block as well, and we're taking a look at that and kind of the spacing requirements. But as you start to get around that corner and how that may impact it, we're not going to be able to get as many spaces, but it's something we'll take a look at for additional street parking in front of this. But the other thing that comes into play too is we start looking at Centerpoint Drive, and if it's switched to two-way, how that may impact it. So definitely be under consideration to look at adding as much parking as we can on the street level, but it just really comes into play with regards to the intersections and the visibility of those intersections. One other just comment, that median or that middle aisle where that walkway is, that may shift east-west depending on kind of working with Wanta and Son and trying to line that up appropriately to create some visual effect. We just put it in there because the zoning code requires that you can't have more than 20 spaces before a break in the parking lot with an island. So that may shift one way or another, but we'll work with Wanta to make sure that lines up appropriately with some sort of view shed for the building.
So this project could have some changes based on
This parking lot could
addition of
shift.
street parking or anything else?
I don't know if it'll shift anything in terms of, even if you added the street parking, it probably wouldn't shift anything in terms of the stall count that we have in year 2. This will remain a public lot, and it will probably be heavily used. Even though it's not used now, it's pretty decrepit right now, and it needs to be reconstructed if we're going to keep it. But with the development with Wanta and then also the Lullaby site, I think it's going to be a very heavily used lot. But there may be small shifts in terms of the design. But one of the things that we looked at initially was maybe reducing the width, but it ended up only keeping it a one-way drive, which is something we wanted to avoid, so we could keep it two-way throughout the entire lot.
Okay.
in terms of the review, again, the uniqueness here is that the storm sewer that exists, kind of has one shaped the development for the Wanta project, but also, prevents there from being a building placed closer to Centerpoint Drive. So that's why the city is, one, maintaining ownership and not selling a portion of this property for the Wanta development because of that storm sewer. So if you look in the design guidelines, it states that parking should be to the rear of the property, so that's the uniqueness here. So with that being said, I think it's fitting. I think it'll certainly incorporate a lot more green. I think it'll be aesthetically pleasing. It'll be asphalt. It'll be curbed as well. and we would recommend approval. Again, if the pedestrian walkway shifts, we have the authority to approve that, given the minor modifications condition that's been added.
I just have one further question, and this would be Public Works, but in the North Side Yard development, they're using semi-permeable asphalt underneath the cars, the vehicles. Is that something, I mean, it seems like as we move forward, any new development of parking lots should have those features. So is this something that, I don't think we could,
I don't know
could
if
we
it'd be
insist
the
on
review.
it, or?
You know, I think the commission could certainly strongly recommend it. Given it's not necessarily called out as a review criteria under the design guidelines, I don't know if it would be appropriate to require it as a condition of approval.
But we could assert it as a
I think
recommendation.
certainly.
Sure, okay. I would encourage that.
Do you mind making a motion then with your?
Okay, I move to approve the design review to reconstruct a parking lot located at Centerpoint Drive between 3rd Street and 2nd Street with staff recommendations and with the addition of a recommendation to have semi-permeable asphalt added under the vehicle parking areas. Does that sound right?
Second.
Additional question, comments? All in favor, say
Who's
aye.
I'm sorry, who is the second? Okay.
Yes.
Brian Bolio, 2132 Elk Street. The one question I have is with the reconstruction of this lot, seeing its primary service is going to be the new development, are the developers going to incur some of the maintenance costs over this property, this lot?
I think it's going to remain city property, correct?
Correct.
Its primary service is going to be for this new development. Shouldn't the new developer be part of the maintenance on it?
I don't think that question is necessarily relevant to the Historic Preservation Commission and their review under the design guidelines. That question may be more pertinent to the Common Council or the Board of Public Works that would be approving funding for the property and for the project.
All right, that's all I needed, thanks.
Okay. Motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right. Item 6.
It's quite rare that we have the Redevelopment Authority requesting 3 items on an agenda and having Michael representing the Redevelopment Authority 3 times. But again, this is a request from the Redevelopment Authority. They owned a lot of the remnants of the mall. Well, they owned the entire mall at one point before redevelopment, and Mid-State now obviously is under different ownership. However, the Redevelopment Authority maintained ownership of this addition, which was an addition to the mall in 1998. And you can see that the mall once stood in between Shopko and Mid-State, with this addition again going on in 1998. The roof has recently been replaced on the entire property and continues to leak. There have been photos that have been submitted by the applicant in the staff report showing the leaking that's occurring on in and around the cupola area, suggesting that the cupola is causing these issues. They have been addressed numerous times. Again, Michael can talk about this a little bit further to try to repair around this area to prevent the water from infiltrating. However, it's been to no, it hasn't fixed the problem. Hence, the request is being made to remove the cupola. And upon review, staff have identified that it is not historically relevant. It's almost like a fake historic, given its construction of EFS and metal. and thus we've determined that its removal will not in any way be detrimental to the historic district or to the structure, given the structure is, fairly simple design for the use of retail, which it once was. Now it serves an office use. Therefore, we would recommend approval of removing the cupola. It's my understanding that the other ephes on the front of the building will remain, but just the cupola on the top right there will be removed.
Can it be repurposed in any fashion? That, if I
Make a
recall,
good
what it
playhouse.
You're not the first one to ask that, that's
Well,
why
I know,
kinda
but,
laughed. So, it's
I
it's
recall
something.
it was just as a unit lifted into place.
What's that? I'm sorry.
It was built off-site or on the ground.
I believe
and
it
then
was.
just
'Cause It's
lifted
almost like a
up.
room up on top. So under the cupola, it's like a storage area for stuff for the roof and materials for the roof. So if there's an opportunity to replace it, we've talked with our parks director and is there a spot that we could use it in the parks or something like that? At this point, we have not found one, but I think if there's the ability to reuse it for something, we could definitely take a look at that. What seems to be happening here, and this is dealing with the roof leaking. So Great Lakes Educational Loan Services leases the building from the Redevelopment Authority, and they're in charge of all the repairs to the building. And they've completely replaced the roof. They've patched around the cupola numerous times. Still are getting water leaks through the building. What is believed to be happening now, it's not coming through the roof itself, but the roof of the cupola. When it gets warm and cold, it contracts and expands, letting the water through, hits that boards and kind of goes right through the roof. This was something also noted when before the Redevelopment Authority took the building, when it was Dunham's, they always had a lot of leaks in that front entryway. I think it's just a very poor design. Hopefully with the removal of the cupola, that roof leaking will stop. And, at some point in time, we'll probably look at redesigning that front entryway. It just looks out of place. It looks 1990s, and that's kind of that era it was constructed in, but it's not a very attractive look to that building anymore. So
How big is this cupola, do you know?
how
10 by
big?
10?
I bet you 10 by 10, somewhere around there.
Something like that.
It's bigger than what it looks on the building. Once you get up on the roof and actually look at it, it's quite large. So trying to take it down will be a challenge, and whether they have to disassemble it on the roof to take it down, or they're going to try to take it down in one piece. But it's just been a challenge with trying to constantly do the repairs. And like I said, they completely re-roofed the building, and this is continuing to happen with the structure.
Have they tried to re-roof the cupola?
They have not tried to re-roof the cupola.
Is it made out of, I don't know.
It's a metal.
Metal
It's a
roof.
metal.
Yeah.
It's a metal. And again, at some point with Great Lakes, like I said, they are in charge of the maintenance of the building, essentially like they own it, given the way that we have the lease agreement with them. And they've done numerous repairs prior to replacing the roof. They've done additional repairs after the replacement of the roof to add additional sealants, but it just doesn't continue to hold. They haven't replaced the roof, the cupola, but have tried to seal it, and still to no avail.
It seems like it would be a shame to lose because you got so many cupolas in the city. It is kind of a symbol.
Exactly.
I mean, there's a sign on Main Street entering the downtown that has that cupola silhouette, I believe. So it's kind of something that is, characteristic of Stevens Point to a degree. Old Main, there are cupolas downtown. It'd be a shame to, it is fake, and it's not historical, but 100 years will be historical. I don't know, I just think it would be a shame to lose it, as fake as it is.
Well, I think to say it's not historical is to say that the mall had no place in Stevens Point history at all. And to say that something from the 90s is outdated and we shouldn't care about the 1990s is sort of like saying, why should we care about the 1890s? When you look at the symbol for the Center Point Mall,
It's right there.
it's the top of this building. And it's sort of what, you know, the last remnant of that mall that you could still see, that was the mall. And I know we'd like to forget about that chapter in Stevens Point and pretend like we never destroyed downtown to build the mall in the first place, but I think it's a piece of Stevens Point history. I don't think that the 90s is not a part of history. And to say that that it's not historic at all, I think is to ignore that Stevens Point tried to have a mall.
And I think our body has talked about before at what time does it become historic, right? Because for national historic preservation guidelines, there are actual dates associated with it, but for our local commission, that is not the case. Is that correct?
So,
In the guidelines themselves?
And I'm just curious, the people that redid it, re-roofed it, obviously it didn't work. Why aren't they responsible for making it work? Whatever the
well,
problem
it's-
is.
so the element and the materials that they put on had nothing to do with the cupola itself. So they didn't re-roof the cupola, they re-roofed the building. The concern is what it's coming through the roof of the cupola is what they believe is where the water is infiltrating now.
That little
Through the metal?
park there's that little park behind the Fox Theater that doesn't seem to get much use.
I'm sorry,
Right behind the Fox Theater,
the green space?
yeah, that green space with a patio in it and brick and shrubs, and it doesn't seem to, attract anybody. They just put it there on a 4x4 frame or something.
Yeah, I mean, the Redevelopment Authority also owns that property, and we have a lease agreement with a group to have that kind of as a programming space in conjunction with the Children's Museum. So while it doesn't seem like it always gets a lot of use, it does act as kind of one of the lone green areas within that urban core area. The other part about that is that area was also reserved, and no significant improvements were being placed there, with the thought that the Fox Theater at one point may expand back into that area. That's one of the reasons why it's remained kind of in that kind of state.
Maybe Tim wants it.
No, I-
Move it below.
Heritage Park?
I just have if commissioners are going to argue to keep it, what is the solution? Where's the money going to come from to remedy these problems? That's the other, just the practical matters of dealing with the leaky roof and the damage it's already
Well,
caused.
I don't think that we necessarily, when we deal with private homeowners, we don't, when they say, well, I can't really do that, I can't afford it, we take that in consideration, but it's not a reason not to, or, insist on some renovations that, meet our guidelines.
And I guess from an applicant standpoint on the Redevelopment Authority, and we're not saying that necessarily it's the cost to repair as well, but I think I understand kind of Commissioner Carlin's point in terms of, the 1990s, yes, they are relevant to kind of our downtown, and each development that we do now should look like the era in which it is constructed in. And that's the choice with this, and whether it's an actual historic building, probably not, but 1990s does have a place within the design and the district which it serves. But from a practicality standpoint, it's not serving the purpose. If this commission feels that it should remain, that will be up to the commission to consider. But from my standpoint, I think it kind of creates this fake historic look on the building that was constructed in the late 1990s to replica a lot of what we have downtown, which is one of the biggest no-nos in historic preservation, is to create that fake historic element of it. I'm not saying that 1990s doesn't have a place, but I think what they tried to replicate on many of the other historic structures that we have in downtown, Old Main, and throughout the city, was probably the number one thing not to do from a historic preservation standpoint.
Yeah, we've had that discussion many times about what's historic. obviously, everything's historic. It's a 1990 or 1890 or 1950, and it's a style of that period. It's just as worthy as the styles from any other periods that fall into the historic districts. That he showed on the mug there, they had a university connection, et cetera, when it was built. And how about we'll put it across the street in the new parking lot? You got one covered lot.
Could be a canopy over that walkway.
No, because it leaks.
Going fast.
Use it as a bus
Written out,
stop.
use it as a rain shelter.
Yeah, rain shelter, I like that.
No, it leaks.
It would make a good ice fishing shanty.
There again, we should offer to sell it to somebody.
I think if approved and if we could remove it from the building, that we would try to do something with it if we can. If the commission approves, I don't know how easy it's going to be to remove. I don't know how it's connected back to the building and what's going to be left of it. If it has to come down in pieces, my guess is probably will, unless it just bolts in and can be removed from the rooftop and lifted up and drop somewhere.
Who built that building? Are there any
I don't,
of the original plans around that would show?
we just sent all our plans to get scanned in. I don't know who was the original builder of the building.
I just wonder if it was built as a piece, lifted in place, if you're gonna take it down to try and put it someplace else, is it possible to just lift it up, do the roof, and put it back down?
What you have up there, you have a structure up there that's affected by the wind that comes off the Wisconsin River. You get a lot of rocking motion. I've done thousands of roof things all over the United States. And that's what you get, that rocking up and back from the elements. Then you get the freeze thaw around the base. And what happens is eventually that stuff lets go, and you get the seepage and leakage that comes in there. That's what you're seeing in the interior of those tiles. It's common. Anytime you put something on top of the square surface that high up, the wind's gonna get it. All the other elements are gonna affect it.
But then that's gonna be true no matter what you put up there.
But the intent would be to
Just
put it
flat.
flat. It'd be flat roof.
But that's still gonna be a problem.
No, not if they seal it.
Flat.
Well, okay, lift it up, seal it, put it back, and there's,
The problem is the argument that Jim, I believe, is making, is that when you put it back, it's still gonna rock, and it's still gonna put pressure on that to create points of entry for water infiltration after it rips through the top of the roof.
Have you
Sure.
had it inspected and that was the conclusion reached?
That was the roofers that went up on it.
Okay.
Short of making it, redoing the structural components of the building so it doesn't move, because of it, adding it just to the top as a separate piece is what probably the design flaw is. Other than making it a structural component of the main building, you're probably not gonna get away from that. And again, this is not the first time the RA has dealt with this. They too came to that situation probably about a year and a half ago and had told Great Lakes, no, that we were going to be keeping it, we're not gonna be removing it. Since they've gone through this now several times with re-roofing and then doing additional work around the structure because of additional leakage after the re-roofing, it's getting to a point where it's becoming very problematic for the tenant. And the RA did agree yesterday to allow them to remove it. So, but of course, it's up to this body to approve that.
so I'm not an engineer. Would it be possible to figure out a way to attach it, as you're suggesting? Build it into that tower, as opposed to just a cap?
Could there be a way? I'm sure there could be. would probably require opening up the roof area and taking it to the beams or the structural framing of the wall and the roof. But could there be a way? I'm sure you could make it stay. You could structurally reinforce pretty much anything.
Well, the first idea is they'd have to get up there and figure out if it can be removed as one piece. If it can't, kind of a moot point, I guess. If it could be removed in one piece, store it somewhere, for what purpose? Covered parking in the new lot, I think, is about the best
Still
option.
have the clock from the mall.
Where do you have the clock?
So we have the clock in storage. You know, until we have a permanent use for it. But I guess another point I make is that this body also allowed for the raising of the mall in that structure in the 1990s. And this was a component of that same mall of this body, which
That you're gonna hold us to that now?
prior decisions come back to haunt you, right? But I understand the concerns with it, but from a practicality standpoint, it's not working for the Redevelopment Authority and its current tenant. And to lose a very good tenant and and I'm not playing the economic driver in downtown, but it's becoming a very detrimental component to having a good tenant in that building that serves a very good need for downtown. And I think, given the nature of that structure, I would not consider it a historic structure. Yes, it was built in an era in which certain things still remain, but again, I go back to the point is that it was a replica of other cupolas that were done around Stevens Point.
Apparently done poorly at the time, so.
You know, to Michael's point, the roof itself, the entire roofing structure is probably not considered historic. I think we can all agree that a flat rubber roof is not necessarily historic. However, maybe a parapet that's constructed of 100-year-old brick that sits on top of the roof might have historic elements because it blends into the front character of the commercial storefront. In this case, we're not dealing with a historic roof. We're dealing with a feature that was tied to a past use that, you know, could be argued whether or not it's historic, given, you know, the mall and all the complications with the mall and the successes and failures and so forth. But the point I'm trying to make is that the roof itself is not historic. And I don't feel as though then to preserve a feature of a non-historic roof that doesn't necessarily play into the historic nature of that roof would be appropriate under the design guidelines reviewed, specifically Standard 1 and Standard 2. It also, you know, it's not, the roof itself isn't necessarily unique. It's not constructed out of clay tiles or, you know, wood or, you know, unique shingles, cedar shake or anything like that. It's you know, simple materials. I also then feel as though that it probably doesn't need to be preserved for that reason. However, I also mentioned in my staff report that it does have ties and connections to Centerpoint Marketplace and the marketing, drawings, advertising for the mall. But again, prior to 1998, was there another cupola on the mall? Was there one on the Shopko side, main entrance? So, you know, prior to the mall's existence, what defined the mall up until 1998 when the cupola was added?
Well, I think they used a variant of this logo prior to 1998. The Centerpoint used the cupola that was off of the Chila building. That's off the square. And I have a book here that shows the old marketing material from Centerpoint as opposed to the one that I brought today. But this one is clearly the one that's on top of that building. But I think the original intent, when the mall started using that logo, it was from that Chila building.
think you're correct.
It's like the only warm, fuzzy thing remaining of that whole time period. It became signage, it became a concept, it became all these other things that we're trying to figure out, can we do without?
There was all these kiosks on Main Street that had it, the image on it. Yeah, where you could put your band's poster and stuff.
True enough.
Is it leaking now, or will
That
it
was-
start leaking?
That was recent.
Okay. So snow melting,
That was the recent one. I think that was given to me, I think towards in December. And I told Great Lakes that we would have to go through this process as well as the Redevelopment Authority for the reconsideration of their request.
Can we approve the removal and some attempt being made to remove it as a single piece? And then, once it's sitting on the ground, trying to figure out what to do with it?
If I can have the city find a place to store it, which I think maybe.
Oh, we have that parking lot across the street.
it'd probably be cheaper just to rebuild another replica.
Well, again, I mean, maybe you save the roof part of it, but the other stuff is just 2x4s.
Yeah.
You know, maybe there is an element for, you know, a park feature that we could look at putting this in somewhere, but to save the whole structure itself, I think is probably a waste. Saving the top portion and then maybe reconstructing a bottom portion for another use might be more applicable, but it's something we can take a look at. Like I said, you were not the first person who asked that, and I have reached out to our parks director to see if there is any place, maybe even within one of the parks, that this might work for something else.
Listening to this discussion, it sort of convinces me that this is a sign. It's a very big sign, and it's a three-dimensional sign, but it's not a structural feature. It's emblematic, and therefore it fits with what I consider a sign to be. So if we're making a decision about a sign and preserving a sign, that's probably a different way to think about it, and then the practicality of that.
Yeah. I'm going to make a motion then that can be removed, some effort put into removing it in one piece, but not a major requirement.
I'll second that.
So can you clarify, Chairperson, that you are requiring it to be saved, or you're requiring it if possible?
Possible.
Okay.
And explore the possibility of removing it as one piece.
Do you want,
Do with it after that, though.
do you want
Historical
the elements,
Important flow.
do you want any elements to be saved? For example, if the structure itself can't be saved, but the roof can be saved, is that what you're recommending, that any component of the structure itself that can be salvaged or saved be done so?
Yes.
Okay.
I know. It certainly doesn't go.
Both the buildings sit on just a postage stamp.
I mean, it's clearly character defining, I mean, in my opinion, right? I mean, the mug. Oh, this one's tough.
What's the cost for keeping it?
Can't do this.
Sir.
Yeah. let's see. I'm losing track. Where are we? We've got
All
a
right, so
motion.
you made a motion, Tori seconded, so there's a motion on the floor, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. So, with that motion, all in favor say aye.
Do you mind if I call a roll on this one also?
Sure.
Okay. Beveridge,
Aye.
Jennings,
Aye.
Siebert,
Aye.
Scripps,
Nay.
DeBusch.
Aye.
Motion carries 4-1.
Okay.
All right, so the last item here is a request from the city. Mark Cordes, our neighborhood improvement coordinator, has been working with Create Portage County to create a program to decorate the downtown trash receptacles as well as landscape planters. The program has somewhat been hashed out and is summarized in the staff memo, but specific guidelines have not yet been created for the program, given, we still trying to work with the Public Works Department to identify if there's certain costs that need to be covered for either paint materials or for, assistance in any way, as well as then organizing how volunteers would be organized to prep a lot of the receptacles. But ultimately, it would be it's thought to be a program that would be done every year that would involve painting these trash receptacles. There are 14 and 7 planters within the downtown, and then a contest that could be linked to either a downtown a downtown program, or I think it's the Arts Walk that they wanted to link it to every year, that then would judge these artistic pieces, and then potentially the winner of the contest would then remain, and then all the other remaining receptacles and planters would then be, maybe kept for a year, repainted the following spring, and then the contest would happen year after year. So there'd be a changing array of artwork within the public realm, within the downtown. From a vibrancy standpoint, I think it would certainly be very unique to Stevens Point. The one fear that I have is that, are we opening the door to additional graffiti on other buildings or other public infrastructure? I think if there are guidelines that are created that outline, no profanity, no politics, no inappropriate images, I think it'll probably be well received. I also think it's important to get the business owners in downtown to receive their support. So I would advise that Mark, who again is kind of spearheading this with Create, work with those business owners, if approval is granted by this body, to draft those guidelines, to get that approval. And then I would advise that myself and the chairperson would approve those guidelines to make sure that there isn't going to be profanity and inappropriate images, and if so, that we have a mechanism within the guidelines that allows either the Public Works Department or somebody to paint over that inappropriate image or the original artist, and then even if it's unsuccessful the first year, that it wouldn't then continue following years. And here are some examples of what other communities have done. You can see there's some planters, very large planters there that have been painted. In other communities, I can't specifically tell you what communities these are, but I think for the most part, they're pretty well received within other communities. And I think personally that they would complement our existing murals in downtown, and I would certainly recommend approval of the project.
On the plus side, there's really never been much vandalism to the murals, with the
Right.
exception of that one by the library where people can hide. And clearly these aren't hidden. So I understand your concern, but I'm not so sure it really would be a problem.
And you might be right, it might not be, given it's all very visible in the public right-of-way. But I think still identifying it in a guideline, so when you give, you can give the guidelines to the artist to say, if you stay within these guidelines, you can really make whatever you want. I'd still feel more comfortable having those guidelines.
Sure.
Just in the event that somebody sees it differently. And again, art is kind of seen different in the eye of the beholder too. So I think it certainly have to be a judgment call on whether or not it's inappropriate But again, we probably would never have to, cite the guidelines and ask an artist to remove it, because I think, generally speaking, all artists view things similarly on what's appropriate and what's not.
We had a similar discussion about the Dive Point mural. If you recall, that was going to be a canvas to allow people come in and express themselves. And I know I had concern at the time about neighboring buildings getting tagged or something. And it's the same kind of a thing. Now, Dive Point went a different way, but it still is like sort of the only hidden mural. Everything else is on exteriors. That's kind of an interior space. Seems like it's,
Yeah, the only exception is the library one.
yeah,
There has been some problems there, but that's because it's hidden.
yeah. That gets a lot more traffic
Yeah.
too, probably.
I'm going to pass this down to the commissioners. I actually had ideas about this 4 years ago, way before.
Be a use for the cupola.
There you go. I was talking with people about this 4 years ago, years before I was alder. However, my interest was in creating tile murals, something much more permanent. And it becomes a way of telling a story about the community. I actually, while I am a strong advocate for using art in public spaces, I have real concerns about this particular approach. And these images are not compelling to me. And I think it could be, have a negative impact on the downtown. However, I think something of a higher quality, if we're talking about tile murals, and having artists submit proposals, and particularly tile artwork that can tell a story.
Well, you could set up a theme each year too,
Well, this, yeah, but this is fairly expensive, and I don't want to say expensive to do.
No, but I mean,
It
just-
takes a fair, somebody has to have the skill to do tile artwork, so, but just,
My first thought is art in the park. When the kids paint the house down there, it kind of looks like that.
So who would be, so it's a true partnership with the city and Create? Or is Create sort of, are they going to take ownership of this? And if the program ends someday, are they going to, help with the costs of?
Yeah, I think in long-term, I think it would be the city's goal to have somebody else, maintain and manage it, just given, the city has limited staff. Given it's a new program, I think the partnership exists in terms of ensuring that, Public Works is on board and that it goes through this body, and that you structure it to where it's appropriate as a community program, because it is within the public right-of-way. But ultimately, I think if it's successful, we'd probably like to see it managed and run by another organization. But the city, if there's funding involved, whether it's to paint them at the end of the year to prepare for the new contest, or, supply materials, or canvases, or protecting the sidewalk with tarps, the city could participate that way, which is the financial component, if they choose to do so.
I could picture the trash receptacles, but I thought that the planters had like this really highly textured sides to them. Aren't they like these pebbles?
I think some of them do. So again, it doesn't worry me a whole lot if they're painted, because if they flake off, the contest would happen the next year as well. But you're right, on a textured surface that has, kind of multiple sides, especially something that's round or pebble, it's going to fare or it's going to weather very easily. And
I think it would be hard to paint on something like that too.
yeah, it depends on the artist. I've seen really good artists that use bowls and plates to spray paint in different shapes and things. But you're right, from a hand brushing standpoint, it might be hard too. Spray gun, so there's different styles that I think you'd probably see on these on these public infrastructure. But, you know, again, if the program fails the first year, it probably just wouldn't continue.
I guess I have Tori's concern too. I think these images are not really very compelling. And, you know, I think of the communities that have, you know, they have the painted horses, painted pigs and benches and I don't know how those work. If you have to submit your ideas first, as is done with the murals. I know we spent a lot of time discussing the mural, the Point Brewery mural, in terms of what was that going to look like and was that going to be, you know, acceptable or a good image for Stevens Point. So these to me look like they're done by amateurs, by anybody. And, you know, so what happens if you have a bunch of trash cans that look pretty trashy? Who decide, obviously art is in the eye of the beholder, but who decides whether, no, this is really not becoming of our community. It's not that it just isn't, it has profanity on it, it's not attractive. So unless there's some way of somebody submitting proposals of what it might look like and some kind of juried body deciding this looks like a good image for our community, I think it really kind of opens us up to potentially having some things that look kind of trashy.
There's a couple things I want to mention, and I think if Mark were here or Greg from Create, they'd stress the fact that, you know, an artist doesn't like to get approval for any artwork that they do. I think that's what makes art so unique, because it means a lot more to the artist than it might mean to the general public, and it's looked at differently to the person that's looking at it. So I think if we were to place a restriction on the designs, I think it would kind of defeat the purpose of the program. You know, for example, if we said, you know, you can approve the program, but all the designs for the 21 or whatever there are, I think 21 different receptacles has to come before this body every year. We have to look at all the images and then we select 21. I think it just defeats the purpose of the program. It makes it too complicated, and I think an artist, you know, likes the ability to kind of come up with something and not have to get the approval to do so. And, you know, because it's a contest, you know, I think they're going to put forth the best effort and probably will stick to the guidelines so that, you know, if they win, it stays. And then I think the ultimate goal is that you eventually have 21 receptacles in your downtown of really good artwork. The other thing I wanted to note is that Appleton, in their downtown, they chose to paint all their electrical boxes. So you see the boxes, you know, that either are for either serving properties or the ones that control interchanges, lights. They decided to not necessarily paint the box itself, but they created a plate on each side of the large box. You know, some of these boxes are 5 by 5. And then they've got a protective layer over the top, but you can essentially insert artwork within each of those sides. So you drive down there downtown, and on the corners by these intersections, you've got this neat artwork that exists on these electrical boxes. And it's kind of cool. It's a way that the downtown stands out, and I think downtown Appleton stands out in other ways, the way they're, accepting, the art culture. And I can tell you that we've got a very big art culture here that wants to inject more artwork in downtown, and this is one way to do it. And there are plenty of other ways to do it as well.
Chairman?
Who brought this up?
This was primarily a request from Mark Cordes, who serves as our neighborhood improvement coordinator. But again, he's been working with Create Portage County.
Two things. When we first started doing the murals, we caught the same kind of argument that it's going to look like junk. Well, we didn't know it until we did it. Had it been junk, you'd paint over it and be done with it. It turned out really well. Second thing is, back, if I remember correctly, in '76, didn't we paint the fire hydrants for the bicentennial? And that turned out really well.
I don't think that's legal.
No, but we did it. Little soldiers, things like that. It worked. It turned out really well, so it didn't get trashy.
You're saying no building burnt down because
Nope.
nobody could find
Couldn't
a fire
find it, no.
hydrant?
Personally, I want this sent back, and I would like to see proposals of tile, because, and I'm surprised that tile didn't come forward, because the tile murals, I mean, that's where you're seeing the really great art. I have a lot of reservations about this, personally.
I have a lot of respect for the work that Create has done. I think Create has partnered with the city in really great ways, and so I do trust them as a entity to take on projects like this, but there's part of me that is sort of leaning towards what Tori is saying. I'd rather do this, like, I would rather invest and do it well and sort of vet it like we do the murals, right? Where you take a lot of time and you look at the projects individually and think of them as more permanent installations than something that would rotate annually. And do something with tile or something else that would have more robust, maybe expensive construction. I don't know. So if there's a way to sort of take the spirit of this idea but vet it in the ways that they've been doing with the mural project, I think that would be a cool.
Sure. I was just wondering, we have the.
Well, it's Ryan again. It's just interesting to, all this fun stuff that gets proposed in front of you guys. I'm a big supporter of Create, and I respect what they do. But I, too, have, as an artist and having seen some really terrible public artwork, I have my reservations, too. And I like the idea of it being a more deliberate process, and I also might like the idea of maybe doing a probationary sort of approach to this. Like, maybe it doesn't work out. Maybe they apply for artists to do it. They don't get enough submissions, and all the work is subpar. I mean, what do you do with that? I don't know. So I just wanted to add that in. Mix. Thank you.
Sure. Is there any way for us?
I know Maria wanted to comment as well, if she's allowed.
Oh, sure.
Got to write it down.
Maria Moore, 400 West Harding. Just speaking as a private citizen. I've been working with an art consulting company for the past 10 years or so. Originally started in the East Coast. Picture that, art consultings. We dealt with a lot of things like this, both public art installations. We do publications still every month, Women's History Month, Black History Month. We go through the process of doing artist open calls, and we've done something similar in an interior space, but still going through the process of it. It's a contest. We don't see the artwork finished before it's put up. But what we do is that we do an open call, and we do gather the artists initially. Part of the process is gathering a work of art, so kind of like a portfolio, to show us the type of artwork that they do, their skill sets, what other projects have they done. So it kind of helps us narrow down their skill and kind of the quality of artwork that they're bringing to the table at that time. And they also produce a kind of like a rough draft or initial drawing of what they're proposing to do. So when we do these open calls, a lot of the time we say, this is the space that you have, these are the dimensions, this is the surface, these are the themes that we're working on, things that are or aren't allowed in terms of themes. So that could be, no nudity, no political, et cetera. But we do provide all those parameters when we issue that open call, and even though we're not seeing the initial, the final product until it's on the item or on the canvas, we do have an idea already of what's going up there. And of course, there's always a clause, if you don't follow the guidelines at that time, expect your work to be removed or taken down. So there's always a way to kind of feed or go through artists before the artwork is even put up. So just a suggestion that could also be an option.
just to give you a little bit of background on this, and I don't want to make it another redevelopment authority item either. So this kind of came about in talking with Mark and in just looking at how kind of ugly our planters and garbage cans and trash receptacles are in downtown, in a way to find public art to improve the image within downtown. And this is one idea of just painting them and going through this. I think it would be really challenging to have artists submit renderings or proposals for that specific thing to be placed on the planter than for them to be approved. I think that kind of starts to defeat the purpose in this program itself, and a lot of it's going to depend on how many people actually get involved with this. But the intention here was to be a contest, making it fun, getting a lot of energy within the downtown to take a look at this type of program, recognizing that it's paint and it's easily you can easily cover it up, you can easily remove it, and you can move on. I don't disagree with the tiles, and that I think is another element that we can look at. I guess maybe from this body, maybe looking at the approval of doing something with relation to public art on these types of public improvements, whether it's trash receptacles, planters, to spruce up the downtown. The reason why we brought and reached out to Create with this is that they've had experience in dealing with the arts and the murals, and they did the Point, help with the Point Brewery mural. They did the one in by the downtown plaza through that pedestrian corridor. They've got experience with these types of calls, reaching out to certain individuals and artists to do this type of work. But really the intent here was just to make it more aesthetically pleasing, and then looking to see kind of what interest we get with this. And the other thing that we were looking at doing is working with downtown business owners and seeing if they would get involved with maybe donating certain gift cards for prizes for that winner of the competition to kind of draw some additional interest with this. So that's what the intent in kind of history and kind of where this came from. But I don't disagree. I think we can look at various installations, whether it's tile, whether it's something else. Maybe we only get 5 submissions. We have, 20 of these things to deal with. And maybe this year's a tile installation, next year's a painting installation, or something else that we could take a look at. But I guess from this body, just getting that approval to move forward with this. Obviously, there's going to have to be guidelines established on kind of what can be painted on here and how that's going to play in, and kind of whether or not they're going to be kept and for how long, and is it just the one who wins that's going to be kept, or are we going to keep them all until we get them all painted? But really what we were looking for here is just kind of approval of the idea to start going down this path. But I do think if artists have to show you a rendering before painting it, I don't think the project will be a success. I just think it's going to take too much to go through, and then who's judging that, before it can be placed on one of those planters.
Well, I was just going to say, I would be fine with just that narrow idea, that we would move forward with considering it, but people have got to put an idea out there. You cannot just have people showing up with a bucket of paint. You're going to have a mess, honestly. Anyway, do you want to?
I was going to say, I'd move that we go ahead with the concept, and the staff, or whoever it is, set up some guidelines as to how this would take place. So we go ahead with the concept.
I think you,
And further come back to review or present those guidelines?
Yeah, I mean, we can come back and present the guidelines before we put out a call or a release.
I think you referenced the idea of,
And again, maybe it is doing a tile installation. Maybe we only do half of them with paint and then the rest of half with tile. I think the challenge with tile, yes, you're going to probably get a more professional type look, and probably something we'd want to get to at some point. I just don't know how many people we would be getting involved with this. From a funding standpoint, and while I can't commit the Redevelopment Authority, I think there is something we can look at. The Redevelopment Authority has funds available for redevelopment-related purposes. Typically, we've been focusing on housing, but there are other things that we can do in terms of neighborhood improvement that stuff like this probably is not going to cost a ton of money. And I think there's, even with paint, you can probably work with a local paint store who would love to be on a flyer with their name on it and donate the paint just for a primer or something like that.
I think you referenced the idea too of selected items to be painted. Certainly don't want some pebble stone thing painted and then do away with the project.
No, I don't disagree, but I welcome the idea of other types of art that we can look at. But the goal here really was just to drum up that support and the idea for public art and trying to promote that within the downtown, hoping that things would advance. You know, Wausau does the Chalk Fest. That's not very permanent. It washes away very, very quickly. This is something different, something a little bit more unique.
I can picture 3D faces. Yes.
I think before we could make any approval of anything, there should be guidelines, and I also think that the city attorney should be consulted. When you're doing something like this and you say, well, let's just let people go out and put whatever they want on it, and then if we don't like it, we can just paint over it. Well, if you're allowing the public to come in and paint 20 things and we decide 10 of them we don't like for whatever reason, and you go and paint over them and leave the other 10, I think you might have some potential for First Amendment issues of what is the government going to come in and censor my art when this art is okay. I think you have to be careful with stuff like this, and perhaps a city attorney should be talked to about it first as well.
He's hard to deal with.
Because what happens if you get something like this little blue one up here? And you say that's just horrendous, because I know when I go through the sculpture park, there's some stuff I really enjoy and some stuff I think makes the woods look junky. But that's hidden away in the sculpture park. This is the downtown. And if we have something like this little guy, and are we just stuck with it for a year? Because if we go and paint over it, are we censoring an artist? I don't know those answers.
Everyone Google tile trash can art, and you can see some of the incredible jobs that people do.
I like the idea, but
It sounds like we want to approve
There was no
a
second.
working group. to
Yeah, I
flesh
mean, I don't
this
know
out.
if you need an official approval at this point if we're not going to approve the program. I think if you're looking for some refinement, let us do that and bring that back to you. And maybe there's the option of exploring additional types of art. Maybe it's the tile art. Maybe that's what we start with. We thought of starting with this just because it's simple, it's relatively inexpensive, and it could drum up additional support for future years. And as we want to advance more in future years and get a little bit more complex, starting a little more simply might help do that.
Yeah, my first thought was, could we table this? Because I don't think we want to completely reject it.
I don't think you really even need a recommendation at this point. If you're looking for some additional guidelines or guidance, and you know, I think Eric had mentioned, you know, with the city attorney, I too thought of that as well in terms of First Amendment issues in terms of that. But let us do that stuff and bring it back to you.
All right. For anyone who doesn't understand, my son's the city attorney. Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you all.
and he's very pleasant to
Videos of these meetings are available for viewing on the city's website, stevenspoint.com/videos.